Walter, give us a little bit of background about yourself.
Okay. I suppose I could probably be characterized accurately as a red diaper baby, but was not aware of that until well into my adulthood. It just seemed so natural to grow up in a political family. Both my parents were generally pretty active and oriented towards social justice and peace issues and civil rights, civil liberties, and I've followed in that path as well. Currently, I am on the board of the new Center for Peace and Social Justice here in Syracuse. Have been active in the past on ACLU and been a member of the Peace Council as long as I can remember, sometimes officially participating and sometimes I forget to pay the dues. They're not so good at reminding me. I've been on the board of Peace Action at times. And I guess my other major political activity these days is with the Davis Putter Scholarship Fund, which is a fund that seeks to provide scholarship money for movement people, either for higher education or accredited education, either to help them make a living so they can continue to be activists, or to educate them in ways that will improve their activism. And so the education doesn't necessarily have to be related to the activism, other than that it will help enable it to continue.
Is that a family?
Well, it was originally the Marion Davis Scholarship Fund until about 20 years ago, when my father, who was a regular annual contributor of somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 a year or something, decided this was a great idea, wanted a similar legacy, and contacted them to see if they were interested in being grown financially in a major way with his help in exchange for joining the fund. And it took a couple of years of on and off negotiations. At one point we were about to start our own fund, and then intermediaries, non-family members on the board, non-Davis family members, contacted us and resumed the discussions, and now it's a two-family fund, and we're all quite happy with each other now.
Fantastic. And how needed.
Yeah.
Unusual.
Yeah. We've had quite a legacy of grantees that have gone on to do wonderful things. Right, I would be hard pressed to give you even one name, but we get some pretty impressive applicants, and we fund pretty impressive people over the years. Actually, a couple of former grantees are now on the board.
Do you remember actions as a child that you either went to or that your parents participated in?
Yeah, I remember one of the more interesting and fun things I remember is this horribly cold, blustery, rainy day where a group of black folks, I was a little kid, I think they were organized by the NAACP, but it might have been CORE or something. But we lived in a fairly well-to-do white neighborhood, and it turned out that about a block and a half from our house was a major slumlord owner. And these folks were out picketing at their house, and what I remember is I think it was my mother, maybe it was all of us, but went out and brought them hot coffee and food and stuff so they could survive and stay there longer, and generally encouraged them. So I remember that. I remember my father was very active in the movement to integrate the city schools. That happened when I was, I think, in 4th grade, maybe, when they started busing and integration in a major way. And so I was like thoroughly versed in what was going to happen at school before they made and when they made the announcements, I was sitting there going, that's not exactly right. That's not exactly how it's supposed to be, how it was supposed to be presented every night. My dad was talking about this last night. That's not what he said.
And did I miss, but where did you grow up?
I grew up in Syracuse.
Right here. Okay. I'm just sorry about this.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, my folks lived probably 3-4 blocks from here when I was born. And over the course of my life, we've always been on the east side of Syracuse. Gradually moved a little further east.
And do you have siblings?
I have 2 older brothers, 9 and 10 years older than me. One's in Florida, one's in Vermont. And my brother in Vermont has been more politically active than my brother in Florida. He's a lawyer, and he's done some litigation for the ACLU, and has been a leader in the criminal defense, a lot of criminal defense precedents during the time that he was a public defender. He was Vermont's leading expert on bail issues for a while in the defense bar. So he got the bail cases, the appellate cases on bail from all over the state for a few years, because he developed that expertise.
And so what do you remember about the Seneca Women's Peace Encampment?
I remember being out there quite often, although most of what I remember involves sitting around on the lawn in the front of the house, and I can't imagine that I went out there as often as I did to do nothing but sit on the front lawn, but that's mostly all I've been able to remember that I actually doing while I was there, other than talking to other people, of course. And I remember sort of the galvanization of greater awareness in the Syracuse peace community about it after the marchers were arrested and were held in the elementary school for days.
Wow.
And I think that may have been when I started actually getting more active, but I'm not sure about that either. In terms of the timing. Yeah, the Waterloo. Yeah. And just at that time of my life, I was a practicing attorney, so it's possible that I may have been looking to see if I could lend a hand that way. I don't remember that I actually did anything as an attorney in that situation, but it's now been so long that I've been an attorney, only people that remember me from 20 years ago or more even ever think to mention it. And then I go, oh yeah.
What about the encampment made it something that you would want to go to, even just to sit on the lawn?
Well, obviously, what its purpose and the calling attention to the missiles and nuclear weapons that were very likely at the time. We only knew very likely stored there. And it was kind of like it seemed to be the it seemed to be the most interesting movement thing going on around here then, as far as I can remember. Certainly was to me, or I wouldn't have kept going out there. And the other thing, the main thing I remember is a group of men in Syracuse organizing for the big march to prepare and distribute food and water for the marchers. I've been able to think back and remember that I've talked to a couple of people trying to help me come up with other memories, and we all sort of remember that there was a lot of discussion about men supporting the encampment by doing childcare and stuff, but none of us remember, none of the people I've talked to actually remember doing any of that. So I'm not sure we ever did, or we may have done it and matter-of-factly enough so we don't remember it. but none of us were parents yet, so it seems like it would be memorable, or would have come back to us now that we've all been parents. But the main thing I remember is in terms of actual activity is the days of organizing and gathering up coolers and we spent, it seemed like we spent 6 or 8 hours mashing chickpeas to make hummus, and then making hummus and pita sandwiches and wrapping them up and putting them in the coolers and stuff. And some of the people didn't have cars. I remember I spent a good half a day driving around picking up coolers that other people had found, people that had coolers and needed them picked up, and that sort of stuff. So that's my main memory.
And so was that group that organized of you all, were you friends? Were you already having a men's group, or how did you remember how you came to do that?
I think that came out of Peace Council people. It wasn't my idea. I was one of the enlisted folks and jumped in and enthusiastically thought it was a good idea, but I didn't come up with it. I think maybe Andy Major, who was and still is at the Peace Council, may have been the person that came up with it, or he, at least I think he was the person that brought it to me.
And was the idea of a women's only action or group or festival familiar to you?
Well, I was familiar with Greenham Common, and I know that there was, I remember there was a lot of debate both among the women and the men in the peace movement about that whole issue, and about what made a boy child suddenly the enemy at 12 and things like that. And I used to say, despite the fact that the place would rather have Margaret Thatcher there than me, on some level, it's part of the peace movement, and I'm going to be there and do whatever I can. If I can't go past the house, I won't go past the house. So, that was my attitude. But I remember there was some. It took a great deal of time for the women to reach the consensus on that and figure that out, and it also took time for some of the men I knew to come to terms with it and be okay with it and still be involved.
And were you aware of some men who weren't okay with it and thus didn't want to become involved, or did folks that generally come around?
I don't remember anybody sort of just being, just throwing their hands up and saying, I don't want to be a part of a club that won't have me as a member or whatever. But I do remember people thinking, I remember there were people who were involved, with much more of an attitude of being involved in spite of that. And for me, it was, I just like to repeat the Margaret Thatcher line as often as possible, but otherwise didn't see a huge issue in it. It made, the idea of the idea of empowerment of women and self-empowerment made a lot of sense to me, but the idea that men were somehow inherently less peaceful, I had more trouble with. But I just, just focused on the first more than the second.
And so the way you understood it was part of the reason to have it be woman only was one, to empower women, and something about men would somehow be less likely to be peaceful. That was like part of the reasoning to have women only space?
Well, no, I just didn't see that what I saw, I didn't see that, I saw that there was the potential, part of the potential message that a women's only event, ideology might convey is that somehow men were inherently less peace-loving. And I think maybe I was sitting on the lawn some of the time to counter that as well, now that I think about it. But that, I didn't think that potential message diluted the overall message enough, so I didn't want to be a part of it. But that was the struggle in my mind, is that, I feel a part of this movement, and I'm perfectly willing to be in the auxiliary.
And did you have women friends who were a part of it?
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I know I did. I was trying to figure out whether I was dating somebody that was involved before I was or anything at the time, and I believe I was dating someone at the time, but I think that we sort of came to involvement together, as opposed to my getting sort of roped into it or anything, or wanting to be a part of it as part of the relationship. Just that we were both oriented to be a part of it.
Right.
Is most likely how it happened. I don't have a specific recollection.
And was nuclear, some of the folks in the area talked about being a part of, like, protesting against the nuclear plants in the area. Was that something that was a part of your circle before the peace encampment, the idea of
nuclear power? I'm sure it was in my head at whatever time I became aware of nuclear power. I know I've been, not in favor of the nuclear power industry from the time that I became aware of it, and I can't imagine that I wasn't aware of it by then. I don't remember it
You don't remember
being particularly tied in. No, I think I remember also being involved on that issue, but I don't remember it in connection with the encampment,
Right.
one way or the other. I'm trying to remember when I was on the Peace Action Board. I think that was later. I was on the Peace Action Board before it was Peace Action. It was. I was on the board during the time that it became Peace Action from St. Freeze. So I guess whenever that was.
Do you remember the big action? What was that like for you?
The Waterloo action or the big march?
August,
Red action.
the August 1st, I think, was when you
The big march.
did the...
Yeah. We were. I mean, it was an exciting day in the sense that there were lots and lots of people turned out, and it was. But we were very busy scurrying around, transporting coolers and setting up stations to pass out food and water and stuff, and it was, as I recall, relentlessly sunny and hot, and people were very grateful that whenever we handed them something to drink or eat, and a lot of people in the march clearly didn't know that we were going to be doing that, and were like, it just seemed like a really cool thing to them that we were there doing that and had thought of it. And I remember when the idea came up, I remembered that it was a great way to support the march, and also I particularly liked it because it was the sort of support that generally was regarded as more of a women's role and more traditional thing, to be providing the food and the water for an event rather than being the marchers. So I liked that role reversal a lot, and it seemed like a good way to support the march, both to support the people marching and to enhance the message of the women's encampment and the publicity that it was all men doing the food and the water, and all women doing the marching.
Well, it was rather a slow march, if I remember. We kept being stopped, and that the tar was melting in the street. And so I can imagine, and the water and the food, because it was it took much longer than had been expected. And we were out there longer, and it got hotter and hotter.
I do remember that. I do remember the heat. Yes, we were carrying coolers and passing stuff out, and we weren't sure we had enough, so we were trying not to eat or drink any of it ourselves.
That's a very good female sacrifice for the people.
Yeah.
Do you remember any interactions with townsfolks or people that weren't as happy to see y'all?
There was. I think by the time I was going out there and hanging out on the lawn, there had been some fairly nasty verbal incidents out in front of the place, and it had maybe begun to die down some. But I remember being there when some of that happened. So, and every once in a while, people would go by and honk and wave and seem supportive too. But you know, get the go home lesbo commies and things like that. Folks driving by, and they always drove by a lot faster than anybody with any support. Like they were, getting out of there before they got hurt somehow in their minds. they just, it always seemed extremely cowardly the way they expressed their opinion and got out of there before anybody could talk to them, or worse.
And being at the camp, was it ever something that you and your mom did together? Did you guys ever go out there together? Or was it a separate thing?
I believe I was there on at least one or two occasions when my mom was there, but I don't think we particularly organized ourselves to go out there as a unit or together. I don't know if we ever drove together or whether we just happened to run into each other there. And I remember also Mima Cataldo, who was the co-author of the book that my mom wrote, running into her there. And her kids were small back then. I'm trying to, I can come up with maybe 3 or 4 names of people, but I just remembered having just talking for hours out on the front lawn.
And talking with some of the women who were there, or visitors, or men, or do you?
I think it was. I don't know if I spent any real time talking with women who were there long term. I mean, I think it was mostly folks I knew, men and women who were out for the day, or maybe spent a weekend there, or something. I know I camped at Sampson State Park at least once, and I think that was the night before the march. But I'm not sure whether that was when it was. It was before something significant was going to happen, that we went out the day before and camped.
So while you all were carrying those coolers from place to place, you had to hand carry them, right? Because there were no vehicles on the road by the time people were marching.
Yeah, I think we may have been, I think we had to hand carry them a couple of blocks, but we didn't have to hand carry them along the march.
Right.
I think we were able to, stay, back on the roads that were still open and get ahead of the march and set up again a couple of times. Or get into the middle, where the march turned a corner. We were able to drive up near that corner and set up, I don't know whether we set up tables or we just used the coolers as the tables.
Yeah. Did you use orange crates to...
I remember, like, mostly plastic coolers, like picnic coolers.
Yeah.
But it was a whole hodgepodge, and I remember we were carefully taping people's names on the bottom with masking tape so we'd get them back to them and stuff, because it was just, we got them wherever we could.
Yeah.
How many of you in that group can you estimate were a part of doing that?
I don't know. I remember a kitchen full of people in Syracuse preparing the food a day or two before, probably 6 or 8 people. And I mean, we literally were mashing chickpeas with mashed potato mashers for hours on end. and of course, it was nobody considered the idea of buying pre-cooked beans, so they were soaking for a night and then boiling for hours in an air-conditioned apartment, big pots of boiling beans for hours and mashing them and mixing in whatever to make hummus. And yeah, I don't remember what we wrapped them with. I'm trying to remember if we would have been, we would have had any qualms about using plastic wrap at that point or not ecologically. But I'm thinking that, I don't really know. I'm thinking it was probably wax paper or something, because I think we used to think about everything like that at some point. Whether it was that early or not, I'm not sure.
And do you remember, were there men's support groups from other cities, or was it just your Syracuse group out there that day?
I'm not sure. I don't remember. It's the Syracuse folks I remember, and I was busy, so if there were others, I probably wouldn't have run into them, or I might have known about them at the time. But it took me a while to remember. I mean, I've been thinking all week on what I remembered, and it took me a while to remember that. So.
Do you remember there being a men's encampment set up?
Yeah, that was at Sampson State Park, I believe, in the campground, about 1.5 miles from the women's encampment that men camped for when they were there for support role.
Yeah.
Yeah, we pretty much took over a section of the park, at least the time I was camping there, which I think was right before this march.
Yeah, I thought that maybe the Finger Lakes Peace Alliance guys
That could very well be.
also might have, in fact, might have done some of the childcare, because I thought some of it took place over at Sampson at the men's encampment.
That could very well be. It sounds.
But it's a long time ago.
Yeah.
And
Well, the Finger Lakes Peace Alliance is a name I've heard, and I don't think I've heard it much since then. So that's probably. I must have heard of it then.
yeah. And there were also quite a few interesting things going on that front lawn, because sometimes people stop just very deliberately, or they were passing in like, what's going on?
Yeah.
And so there were lots of people to talk to.
Yeah. It was always very interesting, but I guess,
And
you know, it seems to me I would not have gone as often as I went, as often as I remember going, if I wasn't doing something besides just hanging out and seeing what happened.
yeah.
But I can't remember what that was.
How many times do you think you went?
I don't know. I mean, enough times so that I was not, like I knew the route, I remembered all the turns, and and I didn't bring a map anymore, or all that sort of stuff, and I could, give people direction. I gave other people directions how to get there, and I remembered particular, sort of interesting little landmarks along the way, more often than the names of the streets.
And was it just that first summer, 1983, that you would have
Yeah.
visited? You don't remember after that, then?
Yeah, I don't think I was there after that.
Were you still living at home when your mother was working on the book?
No, but we were both in town. I remember her working on the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I remembered there's a book, there's a paperback book on Greenham Common encampment. It's kind of like a light green with dark green lettering that I saw in a bookstore in New York City while she was writing the book, and I bought a couple of copies, and I still have mine, and gave her that one. So that book and her book are sitting out on my kitchen table this week, because I was leafing through trying to come up with things to talk about here. I had actually forgotten about the Waterloo March incident until I saw it in the book, and then I remembered. I think that was what galvanized my involvement.
is it on your radar consciousness in terms of activism, women's actions today or peace actions led by women?
Yeah, it doesn't, it's not ringing a bell as a major piece of movement activity that I'm aware of, separate from the peace movement in general. You know, I think at that time, I don't know. I don't. If I ran across it, I wouldn't think it was particularly more or less odd than I did then. I think, but it strikes me that in the 80s it made a lot more sense. Right? That's a message.
Made a lot more sense to who and in what regard?
The dovetailing of the feminist movement and the peace movement, that they, it seems like to do a separate women's peace movement doesn't seem as necessary now, because it's not, you know, it's much less unusual for people to think of women in all sorts of leading roles and active roles. Not that there isn't still sexism, but it was a much different time in terms of people's assumptions of what women's roles would be in a mixed group. I think are much more enlightened now.
And at the time, or do you now, or have you ever considered yourself a feminist?
Yes, all of the above.
Across the board.
I think I'm trying to remember if I may actually have been on the. I'm trying to remember if I was ever on the Now board. In law school, I was the only white male member of the Women's Law Caucus and the Black American Law Caucus.
Great distinction, I like that.
So, yeah, I mean, you know, I don't know. It's just equality and the and just the assumption that if given the opportunity, anybody can do and ought to be able to do anything is just sort of so ingrained in me that it always seemed absurd that it wasn't ingrained in everybody else, and that it took so much work to get people to think about it, rather than that it hadn't occurred to me for a while, and then I became enlightened. It just you know, it's one of those things that, I mean, there are parts of the movement that you know, that have taken raising my awareness of before I understood and been felt a part of, but in general, anything that involves people being oppressed or pigeonholed has never really made much sense to me. So it was real easy to be involved in any movement to get rid of as much of that as possible.
And given your lifetime of being involved in these ways, where do you think the state of the peace movement is now?
Short answer for that.
Yes.
I think it's very complicated because it's obvious that the majority of this country is against the war in Iraq, and it's obvious that the majority of the people have not been able to exert that influence on the majority of government officials that can change that policy. And that is, and the fact that that's not more shocking is particularly bothersome and frightening, and really makes me think about Charlie Rangel has for several years saying that there ought to be a draft, and there ought to be a draft without a lot of ways out of it. And a lot of people sort of have dismissed that as nuts, and peace folks have been pretty mixed on it. But I think that if there was a draft, this war might not have happened, and if it happened, it'd be over by now. Because in Vietnam, what eventually turned the tide in Vietnam was not the students marching, but when the students' parents started marching too, that was suddenly a block of people who voted and had influence, and those folks are, I mean, I am one of those folks and I'm marching, but the vast majority of otherwise not particularly politically active people have been able to ignore this war because their kids there's no danger their kids are going to go if they can only go if they volunteer. So it's primarily the poor people and people of color that go because that's their economic opportunities are limited. So I think that as much as I worked hard to end the draft, I'm not sure that the system seems to have co-opted that victory into a victory of its own in this period.
Well, the majority of the troops that are in Iraq are reserves.
Yeah, that too.
Who join because, again, it's an economic thing. They need additional money to live. But the fact that they're being sent back repeated times is
it's a complete corruption of everything of every design that was, in mind when they set up the system.
Right. We heard earlier today, I think, that the suicide rate was equal to the number of deaths.
Wow.
Which is mind-boggling.
Yeah. Yeah, and they get away with, at least among 20 or 30% of the population, they get away with being the ones that are viewed as supporting the troops. The people that are violating all of these, everything that all these systems were designed to do, and putting them in harm's way repeated and abusing them and discharging them in trumped up ways so they can't get their benefits and get their health care.
Yeah.
And and it's criminal, and they're so far getting away with it.
Yeah. Support our troops, bring them home.
Yeah.
What about the same question in terms of your lifetime of work about feminism and the state of feminism today?
Well, I I think I got politicized first on race issues, and then on the Vietnam War issues, and then on feminist issues, and by that time integrating it all into parts of the same whole of oppression in general and social justice. And my view is that in many ways the feminist movement has gotten further than the women have, the cause of women's equality has advanced further than people of color's struggles in many ways, but in other ways there's still plenty to do. I'm not particularly a fan of Hillary Clinton, but it's appalling that people show up at every rally screaming "Iron my shirt," and they sell Hillary Clinton nutcrackers in airports. It's absurdly funny, but it's obnoxious. And on that level, I think people are much more careful about race. But in terms of actual economic equality, I think women have advanced further and been able to move into professions that were traditionally male and that sort of thing without nearly as much opposition anymore than people of color still find. And it's an interesting dichotomy because, both are important, but, I'm not sure which is, I don't know, it's hard to measure which is worse, but it's interesting how different that is, that it seems to be, it doesn't seem to be as socially unacceptable to make overtly sexist remarks as it does to make overtly racist remarks, but in terms of barriers in the economic world, there seem to be less barriers for women than for people of color.
What about that T-shirt?
Yes, the vintage original T-shirt from 1983.
Why do you still have that T-shirt?
I love this T-shirt, although it actually now belongs to my wife because it's a little small on me, and I wanted it to still be worn and couldn't part with it. I never could give it to a clothing drive, so I've always hung on to it.
What do you love about it?
Just remembering that it was there, the design of it. I mean, I think it's aesthetically appealing, but also it represents the time and what I was doing then, and sort of the physical reminder of being a part of that.
You showed me the label earlier.
Oh yeah. I think on one of the many tangential conversations out on the front lawn, the shirts were printed on a brand of shirts that use the name Beefy T, because they're a heavyweight fabric. But I remember we got a kick out of that sort of macho name of the shirt that they chose to print the image on for a women's encampment.
And a vegetarian encampment at that.
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah.